Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be reacting to a 2018 segment from an interview that I think very few people have seen, that I found on Google the other day, from Alex Karp speaking at a festival around ideas, creativity, democracy, capitalism, all this stuff. And in this specific segment, we are going to be listening to Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir's vision for capitalism. How does he think of capitalism? Why does he think of capitalism as an interesting but I guess we can say hard to understand system at scale, primarily because he does not identify as a capitalist, which is why I wanted to actually do this piece on Karp. He doesn't really identify as like a hard right-wing libertarian type of billionaire capitalist, even though he has $1 billion and he is a obvious capitalist as the CEO of a company. He actually identifies more with socialism roots. Karp has a PhD in German philosophy, so he's a very eccentric, unique individual in that his thoughts around communism and socialism and social democracies and how the West should conceptualize thinking about individuals and collectivism, it all intersects given the 12 years he spent kind of understanding German philosophy and getting his PhD in it, with the fact that he is the CEO of a private company that is going to print $1.9 billion in revenue this year. So he's one of those individuals that it's interesting to analyze his thoughts on capitalism because he doesn't have the same cookie cutter response that capitalism is good like every other CEO, but rather has some nuances to it, especially because Palantir also defends the right of the individual, which is intrinsic to a capitalist society, that we respect individuals, we respect their liberty, we respect their ability to pursue happiness, and we don't infringe on that, which is the nature of how a capitalist society is constructed. You have these free markets and we respect individuals. But also at the intersection of that, we have collectivism that has to play a role in a capitalist society. So let's take a look at what CEO Alex Karp has to say about capitalism.
I mean, I think it's very different in America and the U.S. And in Europe. In America, I think that the difference between the wealthy and the poor is morally borders on unacceptable, and the educational system, in my view, is a pre-training migration program to jail. So I think you really you have to reform that. You have 2% of America either in jail or on probation, and the level of literacy is astounding. And so you have to, like, that, if that's capitalism, I still am a Marxist. I don't think that actually works. On the other hand, you have massive innovation centers that in some ways exacerbate it, but so changing the class dynamic in America while maintaining the vitality, and I would like to see America stay more of an immigration magnet, especially at high-end immigration. I think that's under massive assault. So I think Europe is a different situation. I think Europe, the future of capitalism would be greatly helped if there was more understanding that new forms of capitalism are not only nice and needed, but they're of existential value for Western Europe, and they should be treated. Macron actually, I think, does this, but it's existentially necessary for Europe to have a real tech scene, to have entrepreneurs that build companies, accept failure. The capital will follow. But there has to be a real shift in the approach to that. So I think you'd want to import some of the positive things from Europe to America, and for here, except for Macron, I've never interacted with someone that really, as a politician, understands this isn't a nice to have, paint your car slightly more red and you learn another language which will make you even more impressive kind of thing. This is either you figure out how to do this, or the businesses here will just not be effective. And I think European culture and society is obviously one of the precious goods of the world. So more focus and more understanding. You're going to have to change rules. Like, I'll give you simple things. If you build a company, I'm very in favor of labor regulation for working class people. I actually think the unions in Europe are impressive, but you cannot build a company with software engineers where you need a reason for firing them, because first of all, they don't need protection. They'll get a job. If I fire someone at Palantir, they laugh at me. You're like, you're an idiot. Who would fire me? I have a job. I have 5 jobs. I'm going to tell everyone you're the stupid person. In fact, there's some people at Palantir you try to fire, like, you're not firing me. You're not that stupid. So like the idea, but you need to be able to actually control who the founding team is. And a lot of that comes down to, I like working with the person. That's just a fact. You will never build a big company if the 15 people you start with are people you do not believe in. And for example, we had no financing. We only had financing because we had the number one person at Stanford. And we fired him, and we have at Palantir today a no asshole policy. We fired him because he was a jerk. That's why we fired him. And if you cannot do that, you will not build a company from the beginning. And so but Europe isn't going to change. Just like America, it has to be an exit. We have to solve this problem. And I think those are big issues that have to be, without changing, in order to keep Europe the way, to keep the things that are very special about Europe, which I would say are quality of intellect, which is number one, the absolute quality of intellect and thought, and then the structure of society is unique in the world. So it's worth fighting for. But
okay, so a lot of interesting things he said right there that I want to analyze. First of all, a couple of things he says at the top, right? The disparity between poor people and rich people in the United States, one could argue, is fundamentally unacceptable, especially when we get into things like healthcare, right? Why Europe has some of the best healthcare systems in the world and the United States doesn't. The counter argument to that is the NHS in the UK doesn't have the best healthcare system in the world because it's nationalized, whereas the United States with private healthcare actually does have a pretty decent healthcare, even if not everyone gets access to it. So the question becomes the trade-off between the access to that healthcare and the quality of that healthcare at the end of the day. And Europe has made one decision, the United States has made another decision. Nonetheless, Karp's argument is if that's the society we're living in where there's these massive levels of disparity, then he doesn't want that form of capitalism. But, and this is the nuance of a capitalist analysis and an analysis of Karp, the CEO of Palantir, which is why it's so interesting to analyze him. To build a big company, you've got to embrace some level of capitalism, which is the example he gives at the bottom. The bottom example he gives is that in Europe, there are massive levels of labor regulations. Why? Because they protect workers at least more than the United States and other Western nations have done for workers in terms of union laws, etc. Right? Like in Amazon, you're not starting a union, but in Europe, unions are a real thing. So there's a more collectivist identity in Europe, right? Owning a Mercedes in Europe and showing it around, that's not the coolest thing to do. It's a little bit more to be humble. Whereas in the United States, if someone sees that you have a Mercedes, they congratulate you, right? They're you worked your ass off, good job. You tried to fight, you did something that other people didn't do. You separated yourself from the pack and you figured out a way to make enough money, which means you have to do something productive for society and get that Mercedes. There is a fundamentally different shift in the paradigm of how we respect materialism and consumerism and overall building things in America versus and success, right? Versus places like Europe. But in Europe, you've got to be able to fire people, right? Karp's argument was, if you don't like working with the person, I don't need to have some labor union give me a regulation that, hey, you have to give XYZ different reasons for why you fired that person, or else you're a bad company, you're a bad CEO, you're a toxic workplace. Karp is well, that person's a toxic person, and I don't need to give you a reason. I'm just going to fire him. And that's something that's allowed in the United States, particularly in the tech center, because a lot of these people can just get jobs elsewhere, right? Which is what 11,000 people got fired at Meta. Let's say, I don't know, 30% of them were engineers. The 30% of engineers that got fired likely will get a job somewhere else, because even if you're a bad engineer at Meta, you're probably going to be a good engineer somewhere else at a company that's not as big as Meta. So the tech layoffs don't affect the economy as much as blue collar jobs affect the economy. But nonetheless, those people can get other jobs, which is why the types of regulations need to be met with nuance. A European regulator needs to be okay, maybe it's okay to fire tech people without a reason, because that person can go get a job elsewhere. That's nuance that has to be involved in the labor laws, which requires a little bit more freedom for companies to operate, because they have the ability to fire as much as they want without having these massive regulations imposed on them. So this bleeds into the argument about Europeans' existential problem, which is that they don't have a real tech scene. Now, there are some companies that have come out of Europe that have been phenomenal companies. Spotify is one of them that comes to mind. Obviously, there's some more that I'm probably not thinking of in the tech space, but the majority of tech companies come from the United States because we have a culture of innovation. It is okay to fail, as Karp said, which means if you fail, you can try again. People respect that you even went for it. And, maybe it's because I was born in the United States, or maybe because I'm embracing a lot more of the startup culture. I obviously have my own startup, Aldia.io, in the back, but I can't live in a place where failure is not accepted. Not because I want to fail, but because I am so in love with the pursuit of trying and people having a chance. And I feel so much empathy when I see people try to do something, because I'm they're trying in a world in which most people will never have the balls to try. And that has to be respected. That's a uniquely American idea. And I'm oversimplifying it as an American idea, but it's a unique cultural characteristic of the United States that says if you try and you fail, that's okay. We will respect that you even went for it. And so, for Karp, his argument is that Palantir cannot be constructed unless we had the culture of innovation, unless we had people subsidize us with venture capital dollars. And the only way to do that is to actually embrace a little bit of capitalism, even if some parts of capitalism, like massive wealth disparities, are bad. So I think it's a unique viewpoint he has, and I actually think this is what will lead to the success of Palantir. Obviously, both co-founders, Peter Thiel is on the right end of the spectrum, Karp is on the left end of the spectrum. Their disagreements come together at such a unique intersection because Palantir is a company that recognizes protecting the individual is important. Protecting self-identity and protection and civil liberties and privacy and data is important, but it's important because you want to help the collective. You want to help government stop terrorist attacks. You want to make sure that companies can organize their supply chains. Like the individual and the civil liberties of the individual is protected at the intersection of fighting for the collective, which is why there is a unique duopoly of capitalist ideals, right-wing ideals, libertarian ideals, and socialist ideals mixed into the fabric of Palantir. And I actually did a video on this a long time ago that I'll leave in the description that you could watch where I really broke this down. So I think that's the unique viewpoint that Alex Karp has on the nature of capitalism, and that ultimately influences how he thinks about a capitalist society and how he thinks about Palantir long term. So those are my thoughts on Alex Karp and how he views Palantir and capitalism. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks so much for listening and watching. I'll see you in the next one.